Hello and welcome to our first of a six-part parent university exploring restorative practices. My name is Dr. Ben Lester and I'm the administrator on special assignment, leading the Office of Student Services in School Operations. This evening's event is part of the Cherokee County School District's Social and Emotional Learning Initiative, CCSD Cares, cultivating achievement, resiliency, and the empowerment of students. Our vision is that all CCSD students will thrive today, tomorrow, and throughout life with a sense of purpose and self-worth. CCSD is partnering with Nathan Maynard, author of the Washington Post bestseller, Hacking School Discipline, to bring this team's live series about building social, emotional competencies through restorative practices to the families of our district. Restorative practices take incidents that might otherwise only result in punishments and instead help students recognize the impact of their actions, take responsibility for their actions, and take steps towards making things right. Restorative practices also heavily focus on building community, empathy, and the relationships and improving school culture. We are implementing some of these practices with our schools and want to make sure that families have an opportunity to learn about them and make connections between home and school to best support the social and emotional wellness of all children. During the presentation, I'll be monitoring the Q&A, collecting questions, and then at the very end of our presentation, we'll have a moment with our presenter, Mr. Maynard, to answer any questions that you, the families, might have. Thank you for attending and welcome, Mr. Nathan Maynard.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lester, for that introduction. And I want to thank all the parents that are listening live. We're sort of listening to this recording and checking this practices out. What we're going to be talking about this evening is sort of an introduction into what restorative practices is and how we can sort of use these practices in our homes with our families. Little quick introduction about myself. First of all, I'm a father of an amazing 6-year-old son named Asher, and I love to do these practices with him as well as support students and schools. I got started by studying at Purdue University behavioral neuroscience. My first 8 years, I worked in the juvenile justice field. I worked in a residential treatment care center for the first 3 years, and I did more county-wide things in Lafayette, Indiana. From there, I became a school administrator. I did that for 2 years in Lafayette, Indiana, before I moved down to Indianapolis, Indiana, and I opened up Purdue Polytechnic High School, which is Purdue University's first high school. It was for underserved and underprivileged youth. While being there at that school, I utilized a lot of these restorative practices that I've been doing over the years in the juvenile justice field, as well as in education. Throughout that time, I've worked with a lot of families about ways to implement these practices in the home, ways to support our kids through situations, and ways to look at the school and educators as a team to go through situations. A lot of times when we're looking at discipline and we're looking at situations, there's this connotation of punishment changes behavior. What restorative practices does is gives us more of an opportunity to change that behavior and supporting around this. So what we're going to be doing this evening is going over what restorative practices is and ways that we can implement this into our home. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And by going ahead and get started, the first thing that I'd like us to do is I'd like us to think about what has made us smile this week. It's sort of an introduction question. And if you want to participate in the live session, go ahead and put your answer in that Q&A. And then Dr. Lester is going to be reading off those once they do come through. But while those are coming through, Dr. Lester, what's something that made you smile this week?
Nathan, thank you for asking. I smiled this morning. I had the opportunity to take my daughter to school. So anytime I get to do that, it always puts a smile on my face to start the day, I've got a 4th grader in the district, taking my daughter to school and just kind of starting off the morning, talking about what the day is going to be like, maybe listening to some music together. But that always puts a smile on my face when I get the opportunity to take her to school.
That's great. And Dr. Lester, if there's other audience that are participating, putting something that made them smile this week, if you want to just shout some of those out when they do come across.
Spending time with their dogs.
I can relate.
Spending time with their family. See a couple of teacher ones as well that they had a student respond to, they had a similar writing activity and the student was responding to something that makes them happy. And they were talking about getting to go to that teacher's class as well.
Great. We'll see if a couple more come in here, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the this evening's presentation. And thank you guys for the ones that have participated so far. What we're going to be doing with these sessions is we want to try to keep them as interactive as possible.
Nathan, a friend got good news.
Okay, that's good.
An Amazon delivery arrived early. That's always a good one.
We can celebrate to that. Great. All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for participating. And if you're still coming up with yours, feel free to keep putting those in the Q&A just so we can read each other's, stuff that just made us smile this week. When we're thinking about doing something that centers ourselves, something that really gets us in the mode, we got to be thinking about our intentionality for what we're doing. And our intentionality for being a part of this session tonight is to learn about restorative practices, is to learn about ways that we can incorporate this into not just with our kids, but ways that we can integrate this within ourselves. A lot of these are opportunities that we can grow within ourselves and not just kid-facing strategies. So let's go ahead and start out with a quote to go over what restorative practices is. Restorative practices take incidents that might otherwise result in punishment, and in them recognize opportunities for kids to recognize the impact of their behavior, understand their obligation to take responsibility for their actions, and take steps towards making things right. It is a relationship-based approach. It is a way that we can grow within ourselves. We all make mistakes. When we can own those mistakes and work through those, understand the impacts that our mistakes may have on other people, it helps us look at this concept of discipline that we're going to be going over this evening, and about ways that these practices can really support our kids and ourselves. A lot of times when we do something wrong, we may get punished for it. Sometimes that changes the behavior, sometimes it doesn't. What punishment doesn't do, it doesn't allow us this opportunity to learn from those mistakes. It just says, if you do this, this is what happens. Sometimes that punishment may be that learning experience for our kids. Sometimes we start to see those behaviors continue to happen over and over and over again. And when they start to happen over and over again, what can we do to really build this up and figure out what is driving, those situations? When I mentioned that restorative practices is a relationship-based approach, there's 3 components of this relationship-based approach. The first one is establishing relationships. In education, when I teach these practices, this is something huge that I help educators with. Something that I've helped, your school district with as well, with a lot of the educators there. Ways that we can start out and just establish these relationships with our students, and then also with our kids. We understand that we have a relationship sort of baked in there because, we're family. We have those components in there. But we still have to make sure that we're letting them know what this relationship is and meeting them where they're at. A relationship with our kid is a little bit different than a professional relationship, but it still is something that we have to establish with a safe and supportive environment. If we do not have a safe and supportive environment when we're establishing this relationship might feel a little bit more controlled and lessen this opportunity to grow. With these relationships, we also have to look at ways to continue to feed relationships. My son knows I love him. He absolutely knows that I love him. But if I don't tell him every single day or every couple days, whatever this might be, am I truly feeding that relationship? I may be thinking in my head, I have 100 things going on. He completely knows I care about him. But if I'm not continuing to make an effort towards showing him this, am I missing opportunities to grow that relationship into that safe and supportive atmosphere? When I have that safe and supportive atmosphere with my son, I can understand that when situations occur, he's going to look at me as this coaching opportunity, this ability to get through things together. Will I get mad sometimes? Absolutely. Will I, be disappointed sometimes? Absolutely. But we work as a team together because I continue to feed this relationship throughout the time that I interact as his father. The last component is repairing relationships. A lot of times when mistakes happen, we look at, you made a mistake. Now, what do we need to do to fix this? What are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again? We have to understand that there is harm that sometimes is caused to relationships. How can we focus on that harm caused relationships and ways to fix it? In some of our future sessions, we're going to go over concrete steps towards what repairing relationships look like and how to fix things when stuff goes wrong. Sometimes this might be your son or daughter that comes home and had a situation happen at school, and we need to help coach them with how to fix that relationship with their teacher. Sometimes it's ways that we have caused harm to the relationship, and we have to coach and support our kids and show them how we're going to repair that relationship. When we're looking at this is that teaching component that Restorative Practices is going to offer us. When we're thinking about where to spend our time as parents, with these practices, it's a proactive based approach. 80% of the time, we should be being proactive. That is the establishing and feeding those relationships. That's letting our kids know that we care about them. We're going to have ups and downs in our household, but at the end of the day, I want my son to always know that I care about him through my interactions, even when I make those mistakes. When I make those mistakes or he makes those mistakes, that's where I have to be more reactive with these practices, and it's going to give us tools to get through this together. We understand that the more that we show that our kids that we are continuing to feed this relationship, the more it's going to be a safe and supportive environment to, again, use this as a coaching opportunity. One of the biggest things I tell my son often is, I want you to be open with me. I want to be able to communicate with you openly through good stuff and through rough stuff. If I don't know about the rough stuff and I only know about the good stuff, then I'm not going to be able to be the best parent I can be to coach through this. And the only way I can get that rapport isn't telling my son, communicate with me. It's showing him that I'm a safe person, and that's building up that proactive relationship with my son. Before we get into a conversation about discipline, before we get into a conversation about that 20% reactive, I want to first go over a concept about the brain. Like I mentioned earlier, my background is behavioral neuroscience. So Brad, the other co-author of the book, he jokes about every presentation I do, I always try to talk about the brain just a little bit. The part of the brain that we're going to be talking about this evening is the amygdala. The amygdala is the fight, flight, or freeze response of the brain. When this amygdala is triggered, that is all the brain is trying to do at that time, is to survive and to get through a situation. Amygdala responses can happen for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes we can identify what those triggers are. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it takes some time to get to this in a later time, but we have to do this by seeking to understand and talking to our kids about what took place. But once that amygdala starts to fire, the image on the left starts to happen in our brains. The calm ocean or the calm sort of water that we're currently in becomes rough. It becomes something that we're trying to steer and get around. If we come to our kid and we're having a conversation and we are escalated into that conversation, we're going to create more ripples and more effects into that water. It's going to be tougher for them to process situations. We want to allow the water to calm before we can get to a good conversation with them. If we are ever escalated and someone tries to process with us, we're not going to be in that good state of mind. And we want to remember that our kids are in that same boat. They're actually in a smaller boat than we are. The female brain is not fully developed until 21 to 23, and the male brain is not fully developed until 25 to 27. So when we're thinking about our kids, they're working with an underdeveloped brain. They're working with a brain that has that amygdala, that fight, flight, or freeze response to keep them safe. It's biological to keep us safe. But one of the last parts of the brain to fully develop is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the CEO of the brain. That's what makes those decisions. Something comes in and we need to decide what to do next. When that amygdala is firing, that CEO of the brain isn't going to be making the best decisions. If we've ever had a conversation with our kids and we're like, what are you doing? We just talked about this over and over again, and you just did that same behavior again. We've got to remember that they're processing things different than us. We've got to give them opportunities to grow, but we got to first get them out of this amygdala state of mind. We got to make them feel safe. We got to make that water calm. One activity that I want to do tonight that we can use to keep our water calm when we get escalated, and something that we can bring back to our kids too, is an activity called pleasant imagery. If you feel comfortable now, I'd like you to go ahead and close your eyes. Once your eyes are closed, I want you to think about a place where you feel the most safe and secure at. This could be a place in your past, a place in your present. It could even be something made up. Now that you're in this place, I want you to look around. What do you see? What do you notice in this place? I want you to reach out with your hands. What can you touch? What can you feel in this place? Now I want you to think about your nose. What do you smell in this place? What are the smells around you? And lastly, I want you to think about your ears. What are the sounds around you? What do you hear in this place? Now I want you to remember this place and slowly open up your eyes. This is your happy place. This is a place where you feel the most safe at. In this activity, we tag some senses in there to help us remember this place a little bit more solidly in our head. When I'm driving down the road and someone cuts me off in traffic, it's not easy to get just quickly to this happy place. The first thing that's going through my head is all these triggers, all these immediate responses. So the easiest way to remember what this happy place is and remember what this is to label it with a couple words. My couple words is brown carpet. Because I think about sleeping on my grandmother's floor and she had a thick brown shag carpet and I felt really safe there when I was growing up. So when I'd be sleeping there on that brown carpet, I would feel really safe. So anytime I say brown carpet, it helps me remember my safe place and remember some of those feelings and those senses around me in that place. Again, this is something that we can do with our kids once that water is calm. So then once something becomes escalated, we can say, let's think about our happy place. Let's close our eyes. Maybe you could do a couple deep breathing exercises with our kids while they're thinking about their place, but trying to help get that water calm. Sometimes in an escalated situation, and let's say we're at a store or we're driving, it's a little tougher to do an activity like this. But as parents, we want to remember that if we are trying to process with our kid, when those waves are happening, we are not going to get to a place where they're going to remember what we're talking about. They're not going to get to a place where they're going to retain this and look at this as a coaching opportunity. We've got to get the water calm before we can get to that next step. Dr. Bruce Perry, who's a well-known psychologist in trauma, he said a dysregulated adult can never regulate a dysregulated child. We've got to make sure that we are regulated first when we go into a situation. And if we aren't regulated, it's fine to take a break and process something a little bit later. It's fine to get a moment to get ourselves centered, hand this off to maybe our partner, and what can we do to sort of get ourselves back in the moment so we can become regulated. Once we are regulated, that's when we can go to the next step of what Restorative Practices offers with some of the reactive sides of this. When we're thinking about discipline, and we're thinking about what is discipline, I would like you just to put in the Q&A, what do you think when you hear this word? And Dr. Lester, if you can read off a couple of the responses of what do you think when you hear the word discipline?
Consequence.
Okay.
Trouble. Punishment.
Mm-hmm.
Teaching. Bad.
Okay.
Suspension.
Okay. Let's maybe do one more.
Disappointment.
Thank you. Thank you guys for participating in that. And all of these words that I've heard and all of these connotations around the word discipline is what's out there. Perception's reality, right? We've heard this is where we're at. With these practices, and someone said this into the chat, I want us to think about the root of discipline, which is to teach. Discipline is a teaching opportunity for ourselves and for our kids. When situations occur, sometimes the consequences may teach. Sometimes the processing of why did that happen? Maybe that's the teaching component. We know our kids best. These are just strategies we can do to put in our sort of our parenting toolbox for when situations occur. What do we do to sort of navigate this? What does this look like? But for these sessions, I want us just to remember that discipline is a teaching tool, and we want to do what we can to make sure that we're building this up anytime we're having interactions with our kids on this reactive side of restorative practices. We're going to go over 2 steps into discipline and what this really looks like. The first part is we want to always figure out, why is this happening? Why did this happen? When we think about a punishment that occurs, a lot of times it doesn't care about why this happened. You punched your brother, you punched your sister, that's what we're giving you a consequence about. We may hear your side of the story, that's as far as it goes. Restorative practices helps us dig a little bit deeper into this so we can really see if there is a situation we need to coach around a little bit more. We don't want to create sort of this deficit mindset where we look at our kids as, well, they're just a kid. This sort of situations happen, or this stuff continues to go on because they're younger. We want to always look at this as just an open-minded ways to support our kids through this teaching opportunity. Once we figure out sort of what happened, let's figure out a way to fix it in whatever capacity this may be. We want to have our kids learn how to connect dots into fixing what their behavior caused. And we want to work on this concept of empathy that we're going to be going over shortly. When we're thinking about why a behavior happened, I want us to think about putting a detective hat on. When I have a situation happen with my son, the first thing isn't a punishment for the behavior, isn't immediate thinking about the consequence. The first thing I think about is, why did this happen? I want us to remember that all behavior is a form of communication. That's a well-known sort of psychology sort of phrase. When we're thinking about all behavior being a form of communication, what is that behavior trying to tell us? What is that behavior showing us? If I notice that, my kid was a little bit more withdrawn or a little bit more hyper, or if they are more talkative, less talkative, and it's not really their normal, what is that behavior showing us? What's taking place? What can I do to put that detective hat on and understand what's driving that? I like to think about, this situation about a rusty car. So let's say that you have a car and you keep it in the garage. When you put that car in the garage, there's a rust spot that forms on this car. And when that rust spot forms on the car, you pull it out of the garage, and you may try to take that rust off. You may try to put some Rust-Oleum on there so it doesn't form again in that spot, but you're trying to fix that rust spot. Then you put the car back in the garage. A week later, month later, rust spot forms again in the same exact spot. You pull out that car, you spend all this time, this energy, this effort, money, resources, fixing up that rust spot, and you put it back into the garage. A month later, same rust spot happens, maybe in a different spot. What Restorative Practices does, it helps us look up. Is there a drip happening in the garage? Is there a hole in the roof? Is there water leaking on this car? What is causing this rust to continue to happen? Consequences is fixing up that rust and saying, okay, what can we do to build this back up, fix this, repair this in the situation? And that's needed. Kids need consequences. Consequences is a reaction of a behavior. But we also have to say, what is driving this? What is taking place? When we look up and we see what is affecting our kids and that's causing the behavior, that's what we coach around. That's what we support around. One of the biggest drivers to situations, a lot of negative behaviors, is embarrassment and shame. And if we've ever felt embarrassed or shamed, I'm sure we all have had examples, that drives us to be very powerfully charged over something, especially our kids with underdeveloped brains. If they get embarrassed into a situation, that situation is going to go from 0 to 100 really quick. What can we do to coach around that, to meet the needs around this? It's not about just the consequence. It's about seeing what's driving that situation. And that's what some of these strategies are going to be going over in some of our future sessions. Once we understand that, and now it's time to fix this rust, we want to teach this concept to our kids of empathy, understanding how situations affect other people and how behavior impacts everyone. I like to look at behavior as like taking a rock and throwing it into a pond, like the image above. When you throw that rock into the pond, several ripples happen. The rock is the behavior. The ripples are the impacts of that behavior. If I come home and I'm in an excited mood and I give my son a high five and we play Mario Kart together and get some Capri Suns and hang out, I'm creating some positive ripples in that situation. I'm impacting him in a positive way. If I come home and I've had a rough day at work and I don't really want to talk about anything and I have 20 emails to answer and we're just going to do a quick sort of box dinner because I need to answer my emails, let's turn on Netflix, I'm creating ripples with that too. Sometimes we as adults, we can identify those ripples and we can fix that later. Sometimes it's tough for our kids to identify the ripples of their behaviors, understanding who all this impacts when they do something. If they do something in school to maybe get the attention of their friends, they may understand, well, people laughed. It was funny. This was, a fun situation. Sometimes they don't understand all of the ways this impacts other people. And those are the opportunities we have to coach our kids and help support them around these restorative consequences that we're going to be talking about later. The more that we understand and identify these ripples, and these are the other people involved and how that made them feel, the more we're going to coach them and help them become a more empathetic individual, a more empathetic, just human that's going to be interacting with others. When my son does a behavior, it's not just about understanding why he did it, but now it's time to fix it. He fixes it with the ripples. He fixes who he impacted and how he impacted them. That is direct responsibility for your behavior. Let's say that Dr. Lester and I are friends and we have a disagreement. And then, him and I don't talk for 3 days and we show up at Starbucks just to hang out and, catch up, and we just completely ignore everything that took place. We're just going to sort of move on with our lives, act like nothing happened, and continue to talk. The consequence of my behavior towards Dr. Lester may have been not seeing him for a couple days, may have been sort of that rejection of him not answering my text messages or calls. But I never really had to own that behavior with him. We're just sort of moved on. What Restorative Practices does is puts these situations and say, let's work through this together as a family, as a student in school, as a kid with their friends. Let's look through these situations and let's build this up. Let's take responsibility for our behavior and let's continue to work towards making things right. When we take steps towards making things right, again, we work on that empathy component as well as driving successful kids. In the book, Hacking School Discipline, and that's the book that I wrote with Brad Weinstein, we talked a lot about ways to build up some of these proactive strategies and reactive strategies that support educators. We talked about ways that we can continue to use our time in a way that supports everyone around us. One of my favorite quotes is up here on the screen from Pam Leo. She's a parenting author. She said, either we spend the time meeting children's emotional needs by filling their cup with love, or we spend the time dealing with behaviors caused from their unmet needs. Either way, we spend the time. As educators using these practices within my book, we're going to be spending the time either showing the kids we care about them and building up these relationships and working through things together, or we're going to be talking about these unmet needs. Same thing as parents. When situations occur, we want to be looking through those situations and what are we doing to continue to give this love and attention and look at this as a proactive strategy. Look at this as a way that we're going to continue to build up our relationships with our kids. So when situations do occur where there are unmet needs, we've been filling up that cup already. This is going to take way less time. They already know that they're loved about, they're cared about. We've continued to feed those relationships. We can get through this together. But we've got to remember that either way we're going to be spending the time. So how are we wanting to spend the time? So now it brings us into our part of our presentation to get some questions from you all. If you've had any questions so far about some of the concepts that I've talked about this evening, or about anything that you may have had you've read about restorative practices and you're curious about this is a really good time to put those into the Q&A section of the chat. Dr. Lester is going to be reading through these questions to see trends and questions that come up, and we're going to try to answer as many as we can. After we go through these questions, Dr. Lester is going to be doing an overview of the future sessions that we're going to be talking about with a little description about each one. So Dr. Lester, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Thank you, Nathan.
Of course.
Just a couple of questions to kind of get us started too. Obviously I've talked to some parents in our district as we've kind of made this shift and working with you and moving towards restorative practices. And one of the things I hear most often is, as a parent, what's the first step? What's the first step if I'm making that shift to proactive parenting? I love the words that you used this evening, but if I want to make that shift to proactive parenting, what do you suggest I do? What's that first step?
Great question. And I think the first step with being a proactive parent is letting our kids know we are a safe and supportive adult in their life. They may have this perception of us as we're going to drop the hammer if we come home and we see something on a piece of paper from something they did at school, or whatever the situation is. We want our kids to feel like they can get through things with us. We are going to be a safe, even keel for something. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to become dysregulated. We're going to say stuff we definitely shouldn't have said to our kids. But when we do those situations, we fix these ourselves. We show that vulnerability. When we show that vulnerability, we're creating that safe structure for them to feel safe to come to us. If we don't have our kids that feel like they can communicate with us, these practices aren't going to be as effective, because we're going to be trying to force them to get through some of these situations. And we want them to feel open and safe to talk to us about anything.
Thank you, Nathan. Another question that has just come in is, how do you address the underlying shame and embarrassment of a discipline situation when it comes up?
Yeah, and that's a great question as well. When you're thinking about empathy and you're thinking about those ripples, I also talk to my son or students that I've worked with about relating to how they're feeling too, and letting them know that their feelings that they're feeling are normal. A lot of times kids struggle with normalizing their emotions. They struggle with saying, maybe I just shouldn't get mad, or maybe I'm way too sad and I shouldn't be sad. Emotions are normal. It's how we handle those emotions that we want to sort of work through and come up with supportive ways. So when situations do occur, we want to make sure that we're being a good person that we can work through those emotions and show them that it's okay to feel a certain type of emotion, and we just want to support them through that emotion.
Thank you, Nathan. Looks like we've got another question that's come in. Is this effective with teenagers if we are just introducing the practice to them when they're older, or does this have to start when they're young?
Another great question. And so I've done restorative practices now for about 11 years. I've done this with, I got started out working with teenagers. That was my first group I was working with. Then I slowly started to integrate this with some of the younger kids. Then I started doing these practices with adults in the community as well. These practices really open up the door for understanding the concept of empathy and understanding the obligations it takes when you do a situation. It's great to do this when our kids are as young as possible, but at any step, they're going to be learning something through these processes. We want to teach them that mistakes are okay. We all make mistakes, but when we make a mistake, what are we going to do to make that wrong right, and how to get through this? I would much rather my kid make a ton of mistakes with me and me coach them through those situations at whatever age this is, than to have these mistakes happen in the real world without their coach by their side and helping them get through this. So at any grade level, age, even us as adults, I've done a lot of these trainings with schools across the nation and some international stuff as well. And one of the biggest things that really makes me smile is when educators come up to me later and said, I tried this with my mother-in-law, or I tried this with my sister that I haven't talked to in a little bit of time. And the way that we can start doing this is the way of us being a restorative person. We allowing people to make mistakes, we being a safe person, and working through things together. So it's really effective with any age level.
Nathan, that was a great response, and then segue to this next question that just came in about what restorative means. Like, kind of going back to that original definition, someone's asked the question, what is the restorative piece about approaching discipline this way? What makes it restorative?
Yeah, so it's about making that wrong right. When we do something wrong and we make a mistake, what can we do to make that wrong right in whatever capacity that is? There was a situation that happened here in Indiana where there was a group of teens and they burnt down one of our old wood bridges that been up, say, hundreds of, over 100 years old. And it was something that really devastated the community. A lot of people went in and they wanted, something big to happen to these kids. And again, there could be something big that happens to them, but again, it's really tough to make that wrong right. It's really tough to look at that situation and say, hey, we can rebuild this 100-year-old bridge and make everyone happy again. That's not going to really happen. But what the kids had to do wasn't just the consequence side of it. It was looking at the community of how they impacted so many other people. And they had to try to make that wrong right with whatever resources they could and whatever they could do to get through that situation. When we make mistakes, punishments sometimes work, but again, it creates a lot of compliance. It doesn't create this real world skills of saying, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to work through this together and get through this. When and again, working in the court systems for a long time, you could see a kid that got into trouble and then they may be in detention, or they may have, something that takes place where they're out of their home for a certain period of time. And sometimes that changes the behavior. But again, they're not really fixing what they did wrong. And that's that restoration piece. There's got to be a way that we can make those wrongs right and fix this as that coaching opportunity with whoever this is. And that's that restoration.
Thank you, Nathan. In the work that you've done too, across the country, really, with restorative practices, how have you seen that change school cultures or school climates that you've worked in?
So I've seen it really positively affect relationships within the school. And when you think about the relationships in the school, it's kids wanting to be in the school. It's adults wanting to be in the school. It's that we understand that mistakes are going to happen and we're going to work through this together. Just like if we have let's say a student has a reading deficit, they're struggling with reading. If a parent heard that we just take away their books for 3 days and say, hey, after 3 days, we want you to start reading again, we would look at them and say, that's crazy. What are you talking about? Like, they're struggling with reading right now. They need help. They need support. What restorative does is gives that support for behaviors. It doesn't say your kid made a mistake, now make sure they never do it again. It's saying they made a mistake, let's work through this together and let's learn how to get through this. So it's looking at this as that opportunity. So the schools that have done this work are really able to sort of grow from situations, not just on that proactive side, but even on that reactive side of when situations occur.
Yeah, related to that work you've done, Nathan, someone's asking here. So when when you've worked with districts that have implemented this across schools and schools that are using restorative practices for a specific period of time, have you, in terms of measuring success, is that solely measured in, decrease in suspension rates and that kind of thing? Or in your work, how have you measured success of implementation of restorative practices?
Another great question. So we do qualitative and quantitative data with this. We look at referrals, we look at suspensions, we look at expulsions, we look at situations that occur with even small things in the classroom, and we see if those start to decrease. We also look at that sense of community with our kids and sense of community with our staff members. Something that I did with Cherokee School Corporation is something called the Comprehensive Needs Assessment. In that we looked at the data information as well, with the suspensions, referrals, and to see if that drops this down, as well as we looked at that sense of these competencies that we identified as restorative competencies. We build up those competencies so we see at the end of the year, did those competencies go back up? Did our teachers feel like we're now looking at nurturing healthy relationships in a different way? Are we looking at open conflict resolution in a way that's more restorative in nature? When we see both sides of those information, that shows the success of these practices. If I look at a school and I see, or a school district, and I see just the suspensions or referrals drop down, that's beneficial to a degree, but again, that's a data point that sometimes can be adapted in certain ways. That could be something that may have had something completely other to do with it. We want to look at both sides. We want to look at how the kids are feeling, how the educators are feeling, how they're assessing this sense of community and belonging, as well as that data component. If people are interested in looking at some of the case studies out there, one of the best resources is the International Institute of Restorative Practices. Their acronym is the IIRP. So if you look at their website, they have a lot of case studies across the nation and international ones, looking at some of the resources and ways that these practices have been evidence-based, showing they're dropping recidivism and negative behaviors.
Thank you, Nathan. I put IIRP in the Q&A right there for the folks as well. And then we did have a couple other questions that came in related to that. So can you give some specific examples maybe of what a restorative practice would be after a significant behavior, such as a tantrum or running away or hitting for even younger kids?
Yeah, definitely. So let's say, a hitting situation happened, and it's, a first grader, and they're going through class and they're hitting their other peers. The first thing educators always have to do is they always have to look at the safety of that classroom and safety of all the students in themselves. Sometimes when there's a situation where safety is involved, that student may need to be removed from that classroom. They may need to get regulated themselves, build up some of the skills to stay regulated. But we also want to know what was driving that behavior. Why are they hitting? What is taking place in this? Do they feel embarrassed? Do they not feel like they belong? Do they feel like, a situation happened that they can't sort of navigate themselves? And that's what we build up the skills around. Once we build up those skills, that's when we integrate that student back in and help them become successful. We do a lot of checking in with our students. When I have a student that's doing a high-risk behavior, such as hitting several times, and it's getting down to, my situation as a school administrator, that's when I'm going to not just coach them around this behavior, not just seek to understand, but also make sure that I'm checking in with them to see if their plan is successful. And it's their plan. I can come up with a plan all I want, but if they don't have the buy-in with this plan, it's only going to be my plan. So even with our younger kids, even with my 6-year-old son, I build up this plan with him, is this process. And that's the main process of those restorative, is this with process.
Thank you. Great question that just came in about neurodiverse children. Okay, so do the restorative practices work with neurodiverse children, such as those with autism?
Yeah, that's a great point as well. And there's not a lot of studies out there to show the effects of, students with autism or kids with autism and these effects. The biggest thing that we're trying to do is build up this empathy component. And empathy is a concept that some of our kids with some of those neurodevelopment situations can build upon. They can see the impacts of different behaviors and understand what this looks like. Some of the, kids with possibly, personality disorders or other sort of, impairments that may sort of impair some of their relationship building skills. Sometimes they need more black and white than this gray. But again, when we're looking at restorative practices, it's giving this universal approach of seeking to understand what's driving a behavior and then coaching around this. So if I have a student and they may not be grasping onto the concepts that I'm trying to teach and go through with them, it's not just about that. It's identifying the triggers, identifying their cues, which is what their body's doing when the situations occur, and having them come up with sort of a plan of action to get through this together. So it's not just the consequence, it's the plan to get through things. It's that planning component. Restorative practices gives educators and adults this toolbox to seek to understand what's driving behaviors. It's really easy to say, talk to kids and figure out what's going on. But what restorative practices does, it teaches them how to use open-ended questions, how to use affirmations, I statements, I feel statements, and to help sort of not trigger opposition and anxiety. Any student or any kid, neurodevelopment, depending on that, the ways that they get triggered are different. But opposition and anxiety can come out depending on whatever triggers are. So identifying what those triggers are is really helpful with using these skills to figure that out.
Thank you, Nathan. Another good question. Is this an evidence-based practice? If you could speak to maybe the You and I have had this conversation too about the foundational pieces of the research associated with restorative practices. Could you speak to that a little bit and the evidence around it?
Yeah, definitely. And so restorative practices is an evidence-based approach. The way that they got that evidence-based, sort of label is through a lot of those case studies that were done over multiple years in schools, in homes, in the juvenile justice world, and brought this in. Those case studies and the organization that heads that up is that IIRP. They're the main ones that has housed that. That's the group that I first got started with back in 2008, before I started to take some of the juvenile justice terms that they were using and ways they were doing this, and helping integrate this into education. The 80-20 rule is that evidence-based showing of what that is. That's the model and the ratio that they use within the study.
Thank you, Nathan. And one other question that, again, you and I have talked about this a little bit with the coaching cycles we've been through with the schools this year, especially in the beginning. And that really is this idea of restorative practices. Are we compromising safety implementing this in schools? So that's one of the questions. With restorative practices implementation, is safety still a top priority?
Absolutely. And when you're looking at safety, the biggest thing that I look at is what is driving a behavior, and looking for red flags, looking for ways that we can support our students. When you're thinking about safety in the school, and you think about, let's say a student does a high risk behavior and they get a 3-day suspension. They do it again, they do a 5-day suspension. They do it again, they get a 10-day suspension, they get an expulsion. Those are steps towards working a student sort of out of the system. And sometimes if a student can't maintain a safe learning environment, suspensions are needed. Restorative practices doesn't take suspensions off the table. They help them take true responsibility for those situations and help with integrating that student back in. If I have 2 students and they get into a physical altercation, yes, there's going to be ways that they are not ready to be safe in my building at this time, and sort of integrate this back. But what restorative practice does, it just gives us more tools and more strategies that we already have. It doesn't take these other stuff away. It just makes this in a way that we're going to seek to understand what is driving the behavior and see what we can do to support this kid a little bit more through those situations. Safety is always going to be our #1 priority as educators. Me as a father, I want my son to stay safe at all times when he's out of my hands and that's something that we, task the educators at hand with. When situations occur though, I want to make sure that we are really truly figuring out what is driving a behavior, because if we don't understand what's driving a behavior, there could be other situations happening, and then a situation goes from small to huge. But we weren't using these skills and these strategies to understand what else may have been involved in this. Is there anything that you wanted to add on to that one, Dr. Lester?
No, I think you did a great job kind of answering that question. I did have a follow-up question, though, that you and I both will kind of tackle. But one, the first part of the question is, and I think I'm kind of interpreting the question correctly, what are some of the maybe some first restorative practices that you would suggest a parent, if they want to start using this, take from this first session tonight? Are there a couple that they could maybe start researching into or using with their children? And then the second part of that question is really directed towards me about, is this in all CCSD schools? So I'll let you answer first in terms of maybe a couple of practices that they could start exploring, or you would ask they could even go ahead and start and take using with their kids, and then I'll answer the second part.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the main thing, this evening was this introduction to restorative, but some of the strategies I think we should start using right away, if you feel comfortable, is when we see our kids start to become triggered, start to become agitated, withdrawn, something's taking place, we need to first help them get centered. We've got to let that water calm. The ways that we can make that water calm is, again, using maybe one of those practices like the pleasant imagery that we talked about tonight. Maybe it's just a little bit of space, but it's looking at those situations and making sure that we're allowing things to calm down before we start talking about things. If my kid, if I'm having dinner with my son and he takes this plate and he pushes it off the table and it breaks the plate, my first reaction is I'm going to feel pretty angry myself. I'm going to feel this different type of stuff. But again, before I start to go into something, I'm going to separate him, separate me. We're going to get through this, and then we're going to come together and sort of address what needs to happen next. So a lot of times we jump straight into situations. And again, if we aren't regulated, we're going to create more dysregulation with our kids. So making sure we stay regulated first and starting to support the safe, open relationship about communication, about what's taking place, so they feel safe coming and talking to us.
Thank you, Nathan. I loved that imagery all night of the calming water. I love the use of the visuals as well. I think that's so important when we're, talking even with our students across the district, getting them to visualize, whether it's a safe space or to project, where they need to go to self-regulate and calm down, but enabling them, empowering them to understand they do have power over their emotions if they can name them and then engage with them. So visualization, I know, was a big part of this first night too for all of us. The second part of that question was, our other school, or what schools in the district are using this? We're actually piloting this with 11 schools this school year. So it's in 11 different schools across different grade levels across the district. We're going to expand it next year. So right now it's in elementary, middle, and high school. We're going to complete at the end of the month a six session coaching cycle with Nathan and his team. That'll end in the end of March with our middle school, high school folks, and that'll complete those 6 sessions. And then next year we're hoping to continue to work with Nathan. We plan to, and have him out to hopefully Cherokee County. We had to change things up with the pandemic a little bit this year, but get him down here to Cherokee County, and he usually does face-to-face coaching as well with the individuals and schools he's working with. So we're excited to continue the relationship with him, and hopefully next year even grow maybe some of these parent university offerings as well. So right now it is in 11 schools. We're looking to expand it next year and then continue to support those schools that participated as well. Well, Nathan, we're going to shift to kind of closing things down. I'll give everybody just a moment if anyone wants to add any more questions to the live Q&A. I'll monitor that for a couple more seconds, and then we'll shift to, as Nathan said, wrapping up and looking ahead to the other events. We've got 5 more events in this 6-part series. So we will shift to closing this first event. So with just first, Nathan, thank you for your time. We appreciate you sharing your expertise in the field of restorative practices. We look forward to continuing the conversation. We've got some really good questions this evening from our parents and our community. I know they're going to have more as they start thinking about this. And start looking at some of the resources that we suggested online as well. So we're looking forward to the next conversation with you, which will be on March 24th. That's coming up next week, and it's going to be called It Starts With You. And we will explore how to build strong relationships at home to improve the connection with your child and increase his or her confidence. So it's going to be a continuation on the 24th. That's Wednesday. All of the meetings will be at 6 p.m. with Nathan. And then on April 14th, we have a session entitled Family Meetings, Building Community, Begin Your Journey on Creating a Positive Home Environment that Connects Everyone and Builds Strong Relationships. And then on April 27th at 6 p.m., we have Shifting from Punishment to Opportunity, Restorative Questions, Address Behavior and Begin the Process of Reflecting and Repairing Harm. And then we have Effective Communication, Parenting Styles on Tuesday, May 4th. And that is Effective Statements and Social Discipline Window, Learn Positive Approaches to Address Misbehavior and Empathetic Statements that Create Changes in Behavior. And then we'll wrap up the 6-part series on Tuesday, May 11th with the title Mindfulness, Parenting Under Stressful Situations, Learn Ways to Manage the Stress of Being a Parent by Using Simple Techniques that will help you live in the moment without judgment. So we're excited about offering this series to you guys, our community. We appreciate you. You're an extremely important piece of what makes this district a success. I want to remind everyone that the live sessions will be available on the district's YouTube channel later as well. So at the end of the 6 sessions, we will have 6-part series on YouTube available for on-demand viewing at any time. So Nathan, thank you again. And thank you everyone for attending this evening. Good evening, stay safe, and be well.
Take care.